Yakitomy. Try Yakitomy with no ads. Spiritual views. Introduction. Spiritual pride. It's difficult to explain my views without appearing like I'm committing a sort of spiritual pride that runs contradictory to these ways of being I will share. But if I can be heard by inner spirit, not of evangelizing nor preaching, but of listening to my ideas, and simply playing with me, allowing yourself to only imagine their possibility of being correct, I would ask you then, to listen my views as you would, when you're lying in bed and listening to the chirping of the birds and ambience of nature outside. I wish not to be taken as a preacher or salesman whose job it is to sell you into a purchase. I wish instead only to be taken as a verbal noise, where my intention is to dance/sing for no further goal or aim, but dance/sing. Hence I wish to speak to you my views from the disposition of a storytelling style that afford me the freedom to say what I truly believe, and hence a small coercion over the respect/sensitivity/religious tolerance threshold over what you believe now. But such is your right, our pre-agreement, that you reserve, should you not wish to take in the ideas, to play and entertain for a moment. Such is the spirit I approach you now with. Chapter 1. The nature of knowing. We are all capable of fundamentally understanding analytical truths between each other. Analytical truths are just those matters that occur when I introduce a definition for some term. These analytical truths are known by us all, and is the fabric by which we reason and communicate effectively our emotions over projections into the past, present and future. An example of one is Socrates as a man. The term Socrates is the part of the statement that is being informed by the other term man. The relation is as tells us how the latter informs the former. And since we already know what a man is, to some level of agreement, we know that can now learn what Socrates is. If we instead said Socrates is a tree, our ideas of what Socrates is would change. So we have in us all the capability of analytically knowing and understanding mutually/identically, and communicating across these truths. But there are other truths for which requires experience to qualify. Chapter 2. Synthetic truths. Synthetic truths, by contrast, are those truths that requires a referent outside the predicate, that is to inform the subject of a given statement. A referent outside the predict of an analytical statement, one whose predict falls short of one's analytical understanding, and hence is found outside the understanding and into the external world, or world beyond the ego, or the unconscious totality. For example, in the statement trees are green, the subject trees is momentarily uninformed by the predicate. Then the predicate is revealed to the understanding, and informs the mysterious subject as the thing it's referring to. And the thing the predicate is referring to is not just another analytical referent, but a referent that is outside in the world of perception and experience. So the predicate green is a feature of our experience and hence requires the understanding to summon a memory or a present visual, or an imagined depiction of the natural phenomenon. Greens is then referring to a concrete object of perception, and not some logically later abstract concept of green. Therefore, the word tree now can be taken to mean having to do with the nature of greenness, in which case you have now learned something non-analytic. This that is learned is instead synthesized from an utterance that was but noise, and transformed it into a word that now carries in it an attached meaning. Still, synthetic statements can be more complex, and both the subject and the predicate will relate together to form more precise knowledge with the structures of the external world and the nature of those things beyond us egos. Chapter 3 Truths are a process of learning how to understand. So a real learning spectrum occurs in stages, from analytical truths to synthetic truths. That is to say, from the predicate transforming the subject into analytical understanding, to the predicate transforming the subject by virtue of a non-analytic predicate, to the subject and the predicate both drenched in the liquids of experience, and only allows for finer and more precise revisions of how the external world works / nature of things like matter. That is also to say, that learning occurs from knowing intellectually, to learning by acquiring new experiences, to learning relations from new to old or old to new experiences. For example, David is human are two analytic concepts mashed up. Then David is that organism at birth till now are two relations that mash this pure conceptually situated term David, and give it finer color from the intensely experienced as memories, or experienced of things in the present, or experiences of projections in the future as depictions representing their credible possibility. Chapter 4 Learning has a direction, so a spiritual journey then is one of self-discovery. It is about finding relations along this learning spectrum from analytic to synthetic forms of expressions. When applied to ourselves, we learn about ourselves only in contrast to what we are not, that is, to the world outside us, the external world. Alternatively, when we begin learning, that starts with the world outside us, it moves towards, and must be contrasted with what is me, the ego. In summary, you can only know the outside world if you first know the inside. Simultaneously, you can only know the inside ego by virtue of an inquiry into what the outside world is. Science depends on the environment to study any particular organism in it, and the environment is needed if one is contrast what the ego isn't. Hence we are the total organism environments, and not simply one separate from the other. An example of the former: you can only know the outside if you first know the inside. Science's method must observe a particular phenomenon and honestly report his findings. When the findings reveal patterns, those patterns are analytically thought up first, then assigned to the found patterns, and those patterns are subdivided into more precise characteristics that earn separate titles, and many of them treated as separate concepts, and not just analytical synonyms. That is to say, patterns stemming form the inquiry of what is light. Light is a phenomenon that we learn about by first realizing that it's the shiny thing in front of you. The sense perception begins as the point of reference, and branches starting with the obvious luminosity of the sensory perception of light, to a ponderance of its minute structure, wave or particle, or both, and so the world depends on relating back to us to even begin the search for patterns to learns. Therefore, your knowledge of the world depends on patterns that you, the researcher, the subject, must already have, which then forth allows for the relation to occur from new synthetic patterns, that informs its information back into your psychological hardwiring. Should the information reach the bare hardwiring requirements, the transformation is said. You now render the information intelligible at all, and worthy of scientific or sensible status. An example of the latter, knowing the ego only by virtue of an inquiry into the world outside us. The more we learn about the objects in the world around us, we learn what we are composed of physically, and what is possible, that became in the past, or to become in present or future psychologically. What becomes of the ego is knowledge learned/acquired about you. You rose into this world at birth, and you fear you will leave it at death. You began to look like this, and now look like this, and soon you will look like that. You thought like that, you think like this, and hopefully you will think like that in future. You used to sound like that, you now sound like this, and will soon sound how. And of course we can stem into a conversation about the grand inquiry about physic beings, ever finer precisions of sensations like hots and colds, and brights and dims, stinky smellies and sweet scents, and pains and pleasures, to our even finer and more abstract social sense for evaluations over our social affairs, moral/ethical, and immoral/unethical, to scandalous and conservative, to vain and modest, to arrogance and sincerity, to selfish and self-sacrificial, and around this level it appears that the self appears again, but at a higher and later order of understanding. At this level, this reflection of the self appearing back on itself logically and temporally later, if it should mean anything at all, submit that it is the reminder that we are all the same thing, that is, we are not separate egos in a world separate from us. Such is the case, that even resemblance of the ego is found in our later understandings through pursuit of the inquiry, what is the world, only to find a reflection of the thing I apparently am. The reflection occurring at our widest contextual ideologies, that show the world are patterns of organizing, like implementations of systems of behavioral structures and values. And the reflection is simply fueled by the very dichotomy of self-interested-based economic systems versus cooperative-based economic systems, and all those systems in between. So the self is resembled abstracted in our ideologies, and it all begin with a search/inquiry into the nature of the world first, only to find the heavy dependence on ego, to learn about it all and find resemblances along the way. Chapter 5: The Way of the Scientist. Scientists depend on the sightings and findings of other scientists to accumulate knowledge of physical science about our world. More precisely realized, scientists' beliefs rest on the perceptions and beliefs of other scientists' perceptions and beliefs. So science is born from an inquiry about our ego's perceptual senses, and the extensions of these phenomena found. The extended phenomena is then built by larger volumes of observations on the same controlled conditions, to spell our more certain outcome of the potential future. Since a scientist is only but a human being contextualized by the pursuit of adhering to a method that is reliably tied to the finest of our sensibility intuitions. So human beings have perceptions and make beliefs, and then notice, and upon the method of repetition, they see patterns, and they realize that, if human beings are all the same, they can rely on each other to build an acquisition of more knowledge about the nature of the outside world from the ego, by sharing a sacred trust that my beliefs are as good as your beliefs. When it comes to a common sensory apparatus used to navigate around inches, we then consider those true to this nerve merit table insofar as they are trustworthy enough to uphold the merit of the method. The method of honest reporting, for the sake of wealth of knowledge, to feed the urgency variant curiosities of everyone. Therefore, science will teach us the phenomena of the outside as we simultaneously have the alternative choice of direction at every moment, to inquire about your relation to the world. The inside. Chapter 6: The Way of the Artist. The way of the artist is the way of thinking such as not knowing how you are making progress of some kind. But you are, and you seem so natural, so long as you obey a very subjectively known in the present only flow. That flow will take you where in that moment is most appropriate to go. So the way of the craftsman, like the actor who imitates expressions, or the pianist/vocalist who manipulates noises, or the poet who knows best where to rhyme and rhythm so as to time right and really hit him, or the guru who speaks most sensibly his insights without recourse to persuasions that poets use as tools, or the rapper who raps most ridiculously, or the comedian that jokes and humors most spontaneously, or the socializing with a friend wherein the pattern emerges with a new turn, be absurd thereby causing fun, as opposed to being absurd for some further purpose of being seen as funny, which dulls naturally over time to superficiality and fakeness. Chapter 7 Maturity. You are born. You have siblings. You have parents. You have family and extended family. Parents rear their young with more attention and more sensitivity. These sensitivities and attentions are heard brought in the purpose of such political campaigns as No Child Left Behind laws, that reflect a sort of attitude towards the young as a matter of common sense. Cruelty to the young is an atrocity, enough to socially expel one from the community, the herd. Comparable to that of an anguish-filled time-out, the prison system, or a treacherous get out of my house. Expulsion from the school, institution, or country. Total alienation is the practice of many Western societies today. So the model of the parenting is invoked due to the cause of a psychological value system disorder, and is reflected in the social systems that govern our business and leisure activities. Political movements are fueled when the masses are stirred up from some backwards ridiculous policies of governance. People will learn, and so may know that the ugly truth is there present, and that ugly truth is that it's a system, and not a conspirating, pun intended, few malicious individuals to take down, though it's a lot easier to deal with the problems of the system in way of the latter than the way of the former. In fact, it takes as a brave person inside that society to not continue the ways of the system. Rosa Parks, who chooses to make a statement about gender inequality, and how the role of blacks allowed only on the back of the bus, being unfair to her sensibilities, chose to break the patterns of doing and upholding the perpetual beast of a system that she helped to create. Was she to tacitly obey, and not stand up to the challenge? In this way she was an agent of change. But returning to the value disorder system we are all in, as a matter of accidentally being born at particular location at particular time and inheriting the traditions that fall victim to us as its hopeless prey previous to the point of birth, we are all victims of culture insofar as we are individual egos. Though we really aren't, and living on with this ego illusion of self, we bear responsibility to our total collective situation insofar as we care to improve the human condition of the self-interested narcissistic ways of the individuals that organize around social agreements for which bear into existence rules that reflect our unfairly justified ways of conducting business and pleasure as usual. This is true primarily for Western societies. So these ego's illusions we will wear, half on and half off, in an attempt to uplift our collective situation, our human conditioning, then we can properly call ourselves maturing towards this end. A new form of social order must begin in order to lift ourselves out of this condition, except when you stop reading this, and begin your practical life again, going to work, or coming home to see the kids and your partner. In any case, you will forget these new truths and fall back into conditioning. It is only a hope that insofar as we want this goal, perhaps at some times and not others, it is critical to recall to mind out there, outside the container of this discussion, who you really are, and what you really want. You learn that what you really want, you already have, and that you needn't have anything more, because you have it now and enough of it. If you have it now, and no more is necessary, then you will be content, and search nowhere for further protection. But if you don't know what you want, then you become massively insecure, constantly poking and beaking and searching for the answers to come, that never really do. Instead they just introduce another set of problems, to be more anxious and worried as it's carried into a correction or method of restricting behaviors, for the sake of fruitless preventative measures that are supposed to be paradoxically safer and more secure policies for all of the family. Collectively, we are a very massively insecure society. Our behaviors have laws and punishments attached to them, and everything's so defined and systematized that people feel the need for more protection, when they don't understand the nature of the complex systems that are already in place as the establishments. Chapter 8 Maturity is the cursor for changing the systematic flaws of the current establishments. So the family unit is the same. The adolescent will notice his father and mother constantly concerned of his whereabouts, and will act just like an insecure state when conservatize and censor a more delicate way of covering the raw and raunchy aspects that can be done away with. From this context of the family, the point of maturity is to grow off the dependence that you grew out of during the parental childhood rearing days, where you were pampered and nurtured to some degree of appropriate balance. The family unit at first desires to protect the young until they can release him into the pack of wolves they call society, who can be harsh and full of deception for selfish gain. This will parallel with the function of government as we move towards an increasingly liberal, but never overbearingly liberal mentality that, unlike the way that word is usually used, means simply that we learn to trust each other more to the extent where preventative laws render useless, and self-defense loses credibility for anything other than entertainment and yoga, and imprisonment and reinforcement of the utility of imprisonment through media like Dr. Phil and Oprah, that behaviors that must go punished to rid the anguish collected from the masses, by providing a revenge so grievous as to soothe, if ever possible, the wound of the atrocity. Think of 9/11. Regardless of what your opinion is about what occurred, or who's responsible, it's completely harmless to talk about the simple fact that when large-scale atrocities like 9/11 happen, they write the pride of uniting as one for a communal cause, and with the aid of some direction to point towards to rid the pain, they invented an enemy. But what is self-defeating about all this is that the more propaganda that gets put out, the more minds it infiltrates, the more people that it will affect their communities to feel concerned over, and for them to feel like they are conjoined with the rest of the country and having a common enemy, as it unites us for a brief period. The propaganda then is used as a tool to fuel this. Isn't simply the fault of a few elitist thugs that need to stopped, or some evil demon that controls these thugs. The truth is that we are all a product of the conditioning of Economics 101, and the surrounding respect that is built for these principles as the standard values for why selfishness is good for the economy, why marketing works to deceive and condition the market to meet expected demand, and why the salesman's superficial attitude and the business owners and investors' heavy interest is invested. It is why these projects that are worth money are more important than anything, even over the possibility of starving and killing the world of resources, for the sake of not stopping a systematic virus that will consume. If you uphold the symptom, the outlook and attitude of what is globally efficient and sustainable, and what is good for our future as a human race, or as inseparable mind, or as a giant organism dreaming on different sub-regions of its structural ever-extended fabric. Brought to you by Yakatomi. Try it now with no advertisements.